Hey friends, it's me, the Ebony Otaku, the well-rounded holiday nerd. And it is ORKtober. And since I'm a well-rounded nerd who's married to a well-rounded nerd, my well-rounded nerd, Mr. Otaku, has found some selections of orc novel readings for ORKtober. Aren't we so lucky? Today I'm going to be reading from Warboss by Mike Brooks in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. My husband likes the orcs in Warhammer because they're funny, because orcs in space are funny. Orcs in fantasy are not funny because they belong there, but orcs in sci-fi are funny because they don't belong there. And you know what? If he likes it, I love it. Now, I'm going to be straight with y'all. I've attempted this reading about 27 times. This is a version of novel that I've honestly not read much of. So I might be on the struggle bus a little bit on this one because I usually do cold readings of a lot of my Warhammer novels, but these are in voices and tones that are just unfamiliar to me. So, you know what, y'all? We just going to struggle together. This is take number 82, and it's going to be the last one. But for what I've read so far, these novels are highly entertaining. And when I listen to my husband reading them at night, he is just guffawing and chuckling raucously. So if you're one who likes a comedy in their sci-fi, I think these might be the novels for you. So what are we delaying? Let's get to chapter 3 of Warboss. Gork and Mork did not speak loudly to everyone. Many orcs lived out their lives without ever really hearing the voices of their gods, save in the background roar of battle. For others, the weird boys whose heads exploded, for example, they spoke a bit too loudly. But for some rare orcs, like the Grand Warlord Gazgul Mag Uruk Thraka, the voices of the orc gods were their guidance, the fuel that powered the furnace of conquest and violence burning in their hearts, and which was crucial to their success at bringing others under their sway and dominating the galaxy. Snaggy Littlefoot knew in his heart that Gork and Mork were speaking to him as well. The trouble was, he was a grot, and no one cared. He tried to tell others about it, of course. The thing was, the volume of Gork and Mork speaking to you didn't seem to be anywhere near as important as how loudly you could talk about it to other orcs. And when you weren't even an orc to begin with, that wasn't very loud at all. Snaggy was surrounded by hulking green giants, bellowing and roaring and kicking him without thinking, or sometimes thinking about it and kicking him again just to be sure. And not one of them was prepared to listen to the words of their own gods just because they were coming out of the mouth of a grot. It was enough to make you sick. He'd had more than one hiding, bleeding cheek when he'd mentioned the gods, and he'd learned to keep his mouth shut now, more or less. Still, he'd managed to get himself a fairly cushy little number, at least so far as things went for grots. No desperate clutching of an unreliable grot blaster and trying to get close enough to shoot some giant Humy in his suit of armor, or a deadly fast bug-eye with 4 arms and knives for hands for Snaggy Littlefoot. Oh no. He'd managed to blag his way onto the Mega Gargant, known as Da Cruelfang, which was an awful lot of metal between him and anything that wanted to kill him. Of course, he wasn't a passenger. Snaggy and the rest of his little crew were under the theoretical oversight of Mech Zagblutz, a cantankerous old death skull with 3 eyes, 2 of them mechanical, but that was Mechs for you. And expectations of the level of work required from those under his command, which were so high, Snaggy sometimes wondered if the old git had missed his proper calling as a storm boy drill boss. Right now, they were greasing and polishing a collection of cogs and gears, the purpose of which Snaggy wasn't quite sure, but might have had something to do with turning the Gargant's head from side to side so its gaze of Mork could incinerate whatever its commander chose. How long do you think it'll take to kill that last Humy city? Guthink asked, scrubbing at a gear with his shiny cloth. Guffink was hard-working and industrious, and generally made the rest of them look bad in comparison. Dunno, Squawk replied. The others waited for a moment to see if he was going to qualify that with anything else, such as musings on exactly what might cause a variance in the time taken, but nothing else was forthcoming. Squawk wasn't much of a conversationalist. I think it's the biggest there's been yet, Snaggy offered, so it'll probably take longer. He looked around to make sure no one was watching, then took a swig from his oil can. He spat it out hurriedly a moment later. Tasted foul. It had done every time so far, but he had made a point of trying it once a day, just in case one of the others had come up with a cunning plan to sneak some booze under Zagblutt's nose by putting it in a can. Snaggy wasn't going to risk missing out on some good stuff just because he got a mouthful of oil if he was wrong. That would have been cowardly, and that was not the way of Gork and Mork. See, I was thinking that, Guffink replied amiably. But didn't I fort? Well, as it's the last one, none of the lads are off doing anything else, are they? So there's a lot more boys to kill it. And that means it might be even quicker. The lads, Cruffink chuckled mockingly. Cruffink was big, at least for a grot, and liked to throw what weight he had around. Stop talking like you're one of them, Guffink. Any of them hears you talking like that, they'll twist your head clean off your neck. And what's it to you if they did? Guffink demanded, ceasing his polishing and rounding on the bigger grot. Why are you so worried about what an orc's finna think when he hears me talking, Cruffink? You ain't worried about me, I know that much. Snaggy exchanged glances with Squawk. This little exchange held some promise of livening up their work a bit. I reckon you fancy yourself as an orc's runt, Guffink continued, warming to his subject. Does that sound good, Cruffink? You want to do what a knob says? You want to carry his ammo around? Want to polish a shooter for him? Working on a gargant's not good enough, is it? You want to go pick up after a boss knob, then come back and lord it over the rest of us like that makes you all important? Snaggy was expecting Crumpink to belt Guffink around the face, but to his surprise, the bigger grot just folded his arms and glowered. Use a sniveling little whiner, Guffink. You always have been. Use the one who thinks he's important. Use as bad as Snaggy there. Snaggy felt his brows rise, and he was unexpectedly drawn into this conflict. Wait a second, Cruffink. What you mean by that? What I mean, Cruffink said, squaring up to Snaggy, is that we's all heard you talking about the gods, Snaggy. We's all heard you saying that they're talking to you like you something special, but you ain't. Snaggy grinned toothily at him. That's okay, Cruffink. You're just jealous, 'cause the gods ain't talking to ya. They ain't talking to you either, Cruffink barked, his temper fraying. He reached out with his one sharp-nailed finger and jabbed Snaggy in the chest with it. You're making it up to try and make yourself sound important so clotheads like Guffink here might listen to you and do your work for you. Now, that statement wasn't born of any concern for Guffink, Snaggy knew. So as far as old ORKtober went, and GrotKoulter along with it, if you couldn't stand up for yourself, you got walked on. That was the way of the galaxy, and no one with any sense had any problem with it. The only reason Cruffing would object would be because he was jealous that he hadn't thought of it himself. Thing was, cunning plan though it might have been, that wasn't what Snaggy was doing. He wouldn't dare invite the wrath of Gork and Mork by claiming to hear their voices when he didn't. He knew exactly what he'd heard. They're talking to me right now, Cruffing, telling me just what to do. Ow! Cruffing's snort of derision was so forceful that it splattered snot all over his front. And what's that? This! Snaggy kicked him in the shin as hard as he could, which, given he was wearing metal-capped boots and Cruffing's shins were completely unprotected when everything was taken into account, was pretty zogging hard. Cruffing howled and hopped backwards, clutching his shin in both hands. Snaggy laughed at him, enjoying the other grot's pain, but Cruffing's rage quickly overcame it. Cruffing grabbed a wrench and a piece of dirty metal as long as he was tall and swung it in both hands, screaming as he did. Snaggy stumbled backwards, fear replacing his amusement, just as quickly as Cruffing's pain had disappeared, and ducked a moment before the wrench could connect with his head. Then whoosh of air displacement hinted at exactly how heavy the impact would have been had the blow landed. But the force of the missed swing carried Cruffing around off balance. Snaggy had no intention of letting him have another go, so he charged and put his shoulder into the other grot's ribs as hard as he could. Cruffing let out a great huff of air, and they both went down onto the greasy plates of metal that formed on the floor as this part of the gargant. Guffink and Squawk were cheering as though it was any way of a grot encountering a fight in which they were not participating, but they weren't on anyone's side. It was just good old-fashioned appreciation of a brawl. Snaggy couldn't count on anyone to help, even though it had been Guffink squaring up to Cruffink a few moments before, so he grabbed one of Cruffink's wrists in both hands and bit it as hard as he could. Cruffink howled and relaxed his grip on the wrench, dropping it completely, but Snaggy quickly realized that this was possibly a bad development for him. The wrench was big and clumsy, and although Cruffink would have clung onto the weapon instinctively, it wouldn't served him well in those close quarters. Now, however, the larger grot had his hands free to claw and strangle, and that wasn't going to go so well for Snaggy. Snaggy went for his eyes instead. Cruffing howled in pain as Snaggy's nails gouged at his face, but he flailed and thrashed and kicked so vigorously that Snaggy was thrown clean off him and landed hard on the deck again. He staggered, looking for some sort of weapon of his own, but to no avail. Cruffink was too quick and was already coming for him with his fist balled. A grot's punch would barely register to an orc, and even a human would probably shrug it off and swing one back with considerably more force. But they were plenty enough hard for another grot. Snaggy ducked the first and landed a pointy elbow into Cruffink's ribs. But then the other grot managed to get a hold of him by the back of the neck and pulled him up sufficiently to send his next blow with his other hand right into Snaggy's gob. Pain flowered, and Snaggy staggered backwards as the entire gargant swayed around him. He spat out a tooth, stumbled sideways, and caught at a lever of uncertain provenance in order to hold himself up. The last place he wanted to be was on the floor when his head was swimming, and Cruffink was still coming at him. Then an idea struck him. As he wrenched on the lever, trying to break it loose, Zagblutt's engine wasn't always the most secure, and it would make a handy bludgeon. The lever moved. Cruffink stopped as something overhead creaked. It was a deep noise, one that reverberated around the gargant's frame like an episode of particularly explosive flatulence in a Squiggoth stall. It spoke not of the slight settling of a sturdy metallic superstructure, but of the beginnings of something more, something greater, something decidedly more empathetic than just a creak. Very, very slowly, the ceiling began to move. It was almost infinitesimal at first, only the faintest of shifts in shadows and light to suggest that something was happening. Then, as the movement became more obvious, more sounds sprang up, scraping sounds, groaning sounds, the sounds of bolts and rivets pinging off from other fixings, and the sounds of metal flexing in its ways that was not supposed to flex, and tearing in ways it most certainly was not supposed to tear. Snaggy didn't move. He was frozen in place by the fear that most commonly consumed a grot, which could be divided in two parts. Firstly, that he was going to be crushed by something much larger and heavier than him, and secondly, that even if he somehow survived the current peril, he was going to be blamed for it. Oh, sulkin neck! Snaggy muttered weakly, as a thin crack of darkness appeared above him and rapidly widened. That was the night sky. And one thing Snaggy was pretty certain about was that you weren't supposed to see outside a Gargant when you were inside a Gargant, unless you were looking through a window that a mech had specifically put there. The head's coming off! Squawk wailed, showing uncharacteristic perceptiveness and communication. The Zoggin head's coming off, lads! What are we gonna do? There was nothing they could do, of course. At least not to stop the landslide of metal, which was even now carrying an untold tonnage of prime scrap, at least two high-power energy weapons, probably several orcs, and quite possibly one very angry mech boy forwards, and then suddenly and quite terminally downwards. Snaggy managed to force himself to move, and along with the rest of his crew, hostilities abruptly forgotten, ran towards the front edge of the Gargant as the gigantic construction above them scrapped onwards. Snaggy got to the rail of what had been a viewing deck just as the ceiling began to tilt and the head began to plummet. He looked over the edge at the first, of course, and saw nothing but the underside of the Gargant's head. Then, as it fell, it got smaller. Saw the rest of the spread out below. Thousands of orcs gathered around blazing fires. They all seemed to be organized, insofar as orcs were ever organized, into a loose semicircle around the base of the Mega Gargant. And they had been scrambling backwards as the head fell towards them. None of them were under it, but they'd be looking at something which had been. Oh, Gork's green grin, Snaggy breathed, clapping his hands over his mouth. The Zoggin Warboss is down there. And we're going to pick up with the rest of this chapter next week. Okay, this is kind of fun. I'm kind of into the orcs. I hope you're into the orcs. So next week for ORKtober, we're going to read part 2 of chapter 3 of Warboss by Mike Brooks. If you're enjoying this book, we do have this on Kindle. I'm reading it on Amazon Prime. Yeah, definitely pick it up. It is entertaining. Did my husband just make me an orc fan? Possibly. I hope you're having a fantastic kickoff to at least where I'm from, the holiday season. The first of the holidays is Halloween. There are so many more, and I'm theming all the months to the holiday that I am celebrating currently. So I've even got my clothes all nice and themed out to the holidays. It's a lot of fun. So as usual, please like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.